Forti нами в Кремле. Он летал, любимый, родимый, степа и на западной земле.
Spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountain majesty above thy fruited plain. America.
счастья урожай. Это счастье с большевистских башен собирать лишь только успевай. Эх, проучим памятным уроком, кто ворвется в наш советский дом, и за око вышибем за око, а за зуб всю челюсть разобьем. Песня, песня, огненной ракетой озарит родные города. Мы берем победу за победой, и сдавать не будем никогда. Мы берем победу за победой, и сдавать не будем никогда. А девчата, наши патриоты, ни одна от нас не отстает. Эти парни водят самолеты, эскадрилью девушка ведет.
Ребята, есть одна забота, подрасти бы только поскорей, чтоб водить как в самолете, быть бойцом республики своей.
Песня, песня, огненной ракетой озарит родные города. Мы берем победу за победой, и сдавать не будем никогда. Мы берем победу за победой, и сдавать не будем никогда. Когда в 17-м году из искры разгорелось пламя, у всех народов на виду поднялась ленинское знамя, народа твердая рука взяла под власть свободной пашни, и только памятью века остался темный день вчерашний.
Коммунизм, любимый Сталин нас ведет, он дал нам счастье и свободу, он нас на подвиги зовет, великий мудрый вождь народа, он нас на подвиги зовет, великий мудрый вождь народа. Советский край наш расцветал, как майским утром сад весенний, но злобный враг на нас напал, неся стране порабощение. Все как один мы поднялись на бой по сталинскому зову, сердца отвагою зажглись, был враг разбит в бою сурово. Коммунизм, любимый Сталин нас ведет, он дал нам счастье и свободу, он нас на подвиги зовет, великий мудрый вождь народа, он нас на подвиги зовет, великий мудрый вождь народа. Страна весны, борьбу за мир ведешь ты смело, пути твои побед ясны, ты служишь ты земле примером. Мы, как всегда, идем вперед, работе время обгоняем, великий Сталин нас ведет, и мы уверенно шагаем.
Коммунизм, любимый Сталин нас ведет, он дал нам счастье и свободу.
Он нас на подвиги зовет, великий мудрый вождь народа. Он нас на подвиги зовет, великий мудрый вождь.
Hello everybody and welcome. I hope you're reading me loud and clear. Just pausing to see if the new technique I'm using with the recording and streaming system is working, and that you're not still getting my vocals and Stalin tunes at the same time. So if we're all ready to go, what I'm going to do is go into tonight the third and final chapter of Stalin's 1907 work, Anarchism or Socialism. And thank you, Slava, for the confirmation. And this is going to be a walk through the final chapter of this 1907 work. And what I'm going to be doing is, same as always, picking out some key quotations from the work and then looking at them through the lens of our own current situation and talking about some historical things as well, including quoting from the Soviet Constitution of 1977. That's something for you to look forward to there. So, hello to the comrades in the chat. James Graham. Hello to my comrade Terry from the Class Consciousness Project. Hello to Peter. Hello to Kai. Hello to Slava. Hello to Banana Bender. And we're going to be getting into Chapter 3, entitled Proletarian Socialism. And I'll be answering the questions mainly at the end, unless I see something that's particularly pertinent to what we're discussing. And this will be recorded in audio version, and it'll be on the Marx Engels Lenin Institute website and on the Patreon page as well. And right. So, here we go. Okay, ready to go. So, Chapter 3, Proletarian Socialism. And this is the final chapter of this particular work. And what it covers is, of course, as the title suggests, which is the advocacy by Stalin for proletarian socialism against, well, he's writing at the time against the anarchists, and he's, of course, arguing against a bunch of Georgian anarchists who, as I've said in previous episodes, are long since buried and forgotten by history. But judging from the fact that Stalin had to write a proper refutation, they were probably still better than today's anarchists. So, we'll move through the chapter bit by bit and discuss as we go along. And the first part that I'm going to draw attention to is as follows. Now, this is from the first page of the final chapter. It reads as follows. The dialectical method affirms that only that class which is growing day by day, which always marches forward and fights unceasingly for a better future, can be progressive to the end. Only that class can smash the yoke of slavery. We see that the only class which is steadily growing, which always marches forward and is fighting for the future, is the urban and rural proletariat. Therefore, we must serve the proletariat and place our hopes on it. So, a necessary corrective to the anarchist way of looking at things, or at least the anarchist way that as expressed in the Georgian group in the early 20th century. And what Stalin's, of course, reaffirming there is why the Marxist analysis is focused on the proletariat as the revolutionary subject. And that is because, of course, the proletariat, as Stalin says in the quote there, is the class that is always growing day by day, and which, as he says, marches forward and fights unceasingly for a better future. And therefore, that is why it can be progressive, as he says there. So that is worth reminding ourselves of, because there's been numerous attempts ever since Stalin wrote that, but in reality before then, and an awful lot since the 1980s, to find some way of decentering the proletariat from Marxism. And of course, if you decenter the proletariat from Marxism, it is no longer Marxism. And the point I wanted to draw attention to here is the point regarding why it is that the proletariat will be the class which is the most truly progressive class. Because the proletariat is the first, in many respects, truly global class. Now, you've had, of course, before, capitalists do operate on a global basis, but of course they are part of a decaying and passing away system. the proletariat is a truly global class in terms of uniting together by common relationship with the means of production, a gigantic number of individuals bound up into workplaces and communities that offers the chance for the first time ever in human history to engage in a truly global human liberation wave. And that's something that we have come relatively close to at various different points over the last 100 years, that I would argue. And it's something that's worth remembering and dwelling upon, because, as I said, there's been plenty of attempts to decenter the working class from alleged Marxism. Witness the career of Paul Mason, for instance, one of my particular pet hates. But all of the post-1968 Maoists, the Euro-communists, everybody who wanted to either fracture the proletariat into a million different segments or wash it away via the means of identitarianism or anything like that. What you have, of course, these days is a proletariat that is actually far more global and far more actually directly impactful on the global means of production as a result. And you now have, I would argue, a far better chance of actual global human liberation, thanks to the fact that the proletariat is this gigantic global class now that dwarfs the proletariat that existed in 1907 when Stalin wrote that, and is, of course, struggling to go forward all over the world at a time of great reaction in many places. So whenever you're being told over and over again that class struggle is finished, that the proletariat is no longer the center of Marxism, that everything's doomed, remember the words of Stalin there. Remember the fact that since Marx wrote, since Stalin wrote, the proletariat is now immeasurably bigger and is present in almost every country in the world in a way that opens up possibilities for revolution such as have not been seen before. All that's needed is, of course, is the requisite level of organization to direct the struggles of the proletariat in the correct direction of course, communism. So moving on then, what Stalin again is doing in this chapter, he's outlining several things. First of all, as I said, he's responding to the critiques of the anarchists, and he's also responding to the questioning that comes from like reformists, from economists, as in the Bernsteinian group of economists who were essentially the beginning of reformism in the Second International, the outbreak of open reformism. And so he's talking about serving the proletariat and placing our hopes upon it. Now, I wanted to just mention a couple of other things that he goes into in this preliminary part of the chapter, which is, of course, he mentions that Bernstein also serves the proletariat when he urges the proletariat to forget about socialism, and that Kropotkin also serves the proletariat when he offers this class community so-called socialism, which is scattered and has no broad industrial base, as Stalin says. So what Stalin wants to do is to clarify, first of all, what it is he means by serving the proletariat. So in answer to his own question, he says the following: the materialist theory affirms that a given ideal may be of direct service to the proletariat only if it does not run counter to the economic development of the country, if it fully develops to the requirements of that development. The economic development of the capitalist system shows that present-day production is assuming a social character, that the social character of production is a fundamental negation of existing capitalist property relations. Consequently, our main task is to help to abolish capitalist property and to establish socialist property. And that means the doctrine of Bernstein, who urges that socialism should be forgotten, fundamentally contradicts the requirements of economic development. It is harmful to the proletariat. Now, I wanted to mention that because Bernstein's argument that was made over 125 years ago in its original form, this is, of course, not an argument that has gone away. It is still very much present in the form of the reformist parties and their supporters in all, certainly the imperialist countries. And you find it to this day. you will get into arguments with people, particularly in the world of the trade unions, who will argue, oh, why are you talking about socialism? The working man or woman just wants a decent pay rise and job security. And they don't want any of this talk of revolution. They don't want any of this talk of Marxism or communism. They just want to get a pay rise and that's it. And of course, the obvious answer to all of that is that, well, pay rises aren't exactly on the table right now under this particular decaying period of imperialism. And that's a rather obvious comeback, but it happens to be a true one. But more so than that, the idea that the proletariat should limit itself to immediate struggles and that the working class has no interest or should have no interest in how society is run and which class runs it. This is the argument that all versions of reformism do ultimately fall back on. And the response is, as Stalin says there, the proletariat is constantly having to move forward and struggle. If you go back and look at Marx in his work on trade unions and his work in value, price and profit, when he's talking about the constant struggle just to maintain itself that the proletariat has to engage in, even in periods of advanced capitalist growth, which incidentally is when reformism emerges. You see, reformism in its earliest incarnation in the Second International emerges after a relatively long period of upswing in the capitalist economy, around 20 years or so in European terms, in Germany and France, and to a certain extent in Britain, at the end of the 19th century. And this, of course, coincides with the period of the development of imperialism. And what you find is then that you've had this period of growth, and this is particularly true in Germany, which is, of course, industrializing rapidly, growing its economy very rapidly. And, of course, Bernsteinism, reformism, grows up there as a result, because the German SPD, which is the core party, really, of the Second International, it gets accepted to a degree by the German imperial state when Bismarck's anti-socialist laws are dropped. It takes root within the German parliament, within the German Reichstag, and it grows across society in terms of it being a mass membership party. But as Lenin points out, growing the party that much, of course, brings success, but of course, with it comes the growth of the bureaucratic structures within the German trade unions, and of course this has an equivalent process in France and Britain. And with that growth comes, of course, the growth of bureaucratic tendencies, the growth of opportunistic tendencies, and at the heart of all of this is, of course, the theory of the labour aristocracy, which is that the uppermost layers of the working class start to benefit in some ways from imperialism directly, and that this is the layer upon which the labour aristocracy is built, and the requirements then come into existence for the creation of reformism. Reformism grows out of, in the imperialist countries that is, the labour aristocracy. That's what creates it, and that is what sustains it. And that is ultimately where this argument comes from, that the working class is not concerned with revolution, that it shouldn't be concerned with revolution, that it shouldn't be concerned with overturning the status quo. All the workers want is just an honest day's pay for an honest day's work, etc., etc. And I've heard trade union officials say that many, many times. And of course, the reality of it is that that argument can only come from a very small layer of the working class that is actually gaining much more than the overwhelming bulk of the working class in the imperialist countries. And that is what was happening with the labour aristocracy back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Britain, France, Germany, and the USA as well, of course. So that depoliticization argument that comes from the Bernsteinians has its roots within the labour aristocracy. And that is why they argue that way. That's why it's trade union officials who are often arguing that way. That is why reformists always argue that way. Because you have to be growing out of, you have to be based in a layer that does stand to benefit from the current existing set of class relations and the existing set of property relations, to believe that you're going to continually get pay increases just by engaging, as they say these days, with the employers. And you're not. For the overwhelming bulk, 90% of the working class, that is not the case. For 90% of the working class in imperialist countries, the pay will always be the bare minimum. It'll be the minimum the capitalist can get away with. If the capitalist is forced to pay a bit more today, he'll find a way to claim it back tomorrow. So the idea that the bulk of the working class is to be satisfied with scraping a bit more out of the capitalist's hands, which is, of course, for the bulk of the working class, a tremendously difficult process that involves an awful lot of class struggle to get something which could be taken away from them like that tomorrow. And this, of course, is one of the things that is a rebuttal to that logic coming from the reformists. The other is, of course, well, if we want actually the world to go forward, and if we want to actually make progress, capitalism itself is, of course, as Stalin points out in this chapter, holding back that progress. It is holding back economic development. And you could make that argument 100 years ago in Britain, and it would be correct, because you started to see in Britain 100 years ago, which was so far ahead by the late 19th century. But again, to go back to Lenin and his work in Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism, by the early 20th century, you started to see deindustrialization, more and more capital flight out of the country, and the steady deindustrialization that took place in Britain almost continuously for the next 90 years. The only reason it took so long was, first of all, there was a hell of a lot of class struggle. There was 2 world wars that got in the way. But the direction of travel from the early 20th century to the late 20th century was actually relentless. And it's very clear once you start analysing the amount of capital invested by the British capitalist class inside Britain itself and the amount invested outside, you can see in which direction imperialism always goes. It always goes ultimately towards the hollowing out of its home country, because the rate of profit is too low. So you can respond to these arguments of the reformists by saying that the concern of the working class in the here and now, as Stalin points out, is with actually economically developing the country again in a direction that is, of course, in the interest of the working class. Because if you leave things as they are right now, all that's going to happen is that whether it's Britain, Germany, France, Italy, the United States, all of these countries have just been hollowed out for decades. The industrial base has been hollowed out. The proletariat has been forced into lower and low paid jobs. More and more layers that used to be in the upper layers of the proletariat have been pushed downwards. It's a relentless downward trajectory, which can only be interrupted by violent outbreaks of class struggle that may be coming up, waged by the ruling class themselves as they seek to restore domestic profitability. So whichever way you look at this, the old argument from the Bernsteinians is just simply bankrupt. It doesn't hold sway anymore. It might have had some relevance to the labour aristocracy 120 years ago. In fact, it did. That's why it grew. But trying to make this argument now is a fool's errand. You'd have to be a fool to believe it, to believe that the working class is going to be able to barter itself anything other than the bare minimum now, or that capital is ever going to give up anything like even the reforms of the mid-20th century again. So this is why the working class has to be concerned with power, because otherwise all that's going to happen now is just they're going to have their noses shoved in the dirt for the next however many years. So now that we've gone through that, I'll say hello to some more people who've joined us. Hello to Paul Charo. Hello to CJ, live from Richmond. Hello to Ash over in Melbourne. Good morning and happy tomorrow to you. Hello to 1916 Easter Rising from hopefully soon Socialist Scotland. Hello to Jason, my other comrade from the Class Consciousness Project. And if you've not checked out the Class Consciousness Project website, be sure to do so. So moving on then to the next section here. And we're going to be looking at the next quote along. And let me just find it now. There we go. Here we are. So, Next excerpt here I will read as follows. Future society will be a socialist society. This means primarily that there will be no classes in that society, there will be neither capitalists nor proletarians, and consequently there will be no exploitation. In that society there will be only workers engaged in collective labour. Now, I wanted to draw your attention to this because I wanted to also read to you something else, which is from the 1977 amended version of the Constitution of the USSR. And you can find this on the Marxist Internet Archive. Just go under the USSR section, it's available on there, or just Google USSR Constitution 1977, because I wanted to read this to you to make a couple of points about both what Stalin's saying there and about the state of the USSR as it was back then. Now, this is from Chapter 2 of the Economic System. Chapter 2, Economic System of the Constitution of the USSR, 1977. Article 10 reads as follows. The foundation of the economic system of the USSR is socialist ownership of the means of production in the form of state property belonging to all the people and collective farm and cooperative property. Socialist ownership also embraces the property of trade unions and other public organisations which they require to carry out their purposes under their rules. The state protects socialist property and provides conditions for its growth. No one has the right to use socialist property for personal gain or other selfish ends. Article 11. State property, i.e., the common property of the Soviet people, is the principal form of socialist property. The land, its minerals, waters and forests are the exclusive property of the state. The state owns the basic means of production in industry, construction and agriculture, means of transport, communication, the banks, the property of the state-run trade organisations and public utilities and other state-run undertakings, most urban housing and other property necessary for state purposes. So, why have I just indulged you with those particular quotations from the Soviet Constitution of 1977? And it wasn't just a piece of old Soviet nostalgia. Let's go back to the quote from Stalin to illustrate the point I'm making here. Let's read it again. So, a future society will be a socialist society. This means primarily that there will be no classes in that society. There will be neither capitalists nor proletarians. Consequently, there will be no exploitation. In that society, there will only be workers engaged in collective labour. Now, you might start to see why I read that quote out to you from the Constitution of the USSR. Because if you read that, and I would encourage you to read the whole document, it's very interesting, what you can see is that even after Khrushchevite revisionism had done damage in terms of fracturing the planned economy to a certain extent, in terms of growing a pro-capitalist section of the state bureaucracy and of the most extreme right-wing deviationist elements in the party, even after all of that, and of course encouraging the growth of corruption and theft in the state industries. Even after all of that, though, the rules on state property and the planned economy were actually strengthened by the opposition to the revisionists in the 1977 debates around the Constitution. Now, those who are perhaps of the Trotskyite persuasion would scream lies at this point, but the fact remains that the party up to, i.e. the Soviet party, up to the middle of the 1980s, was still very much a party of the Soviet working class, and therefore the plans of the revisionists, i.e. the Khrushchevites, people like Kosygin and others, were perpetually thwarted, stymied and frustrated. Yes, they did a lot of damage. They managed to grow a pro-capitalist layer that one day would be able to act when they found the right vessel in the form of the wretched Gorbachev. But the reason, as I've said before, why they were so desperate and determined to destroy the party itself was that the party, right up to the end, right up to 1989, was the biggest obstacle to Gorbachev and the pro-capitalist layer actually getting what they wanted, which is the destruction of the planned economy and the destruction particularly of those articles of the Soviet Constitution. So let's again return to the appropriate quote from Stalin just to look at it again. So I'm going to read it again just to hammer home the point here. Future society will be socialist society. This means primarily that there will be no classes in that society. There will be neither capitalists nor proletarians, and consequently there will be no exploitation. In that society there will be only workers engaged in collective labour. Now, my point here is that even at the point of the late 70s and into the early 80s, with all the problems that the Khrushchevites had caused, the Soviet Union, thanks to the huge amount of progress it made towards those aims under the period that Stalin was in office as General Secretary, where you had a revolutionary line being pursued, you actually had the Soviet Union and certain of the people's democracies as well, though not as much, go a long way towards achieving quite a few of those aims that Stalin's talking about there. And this, of course, lies at the heart of the absolutely relentless and hysterical opposition to it from the capitalist class, from the imperialists especially, because they knew, beyond all their bullshit that they used to come out with about pretending to care about things like human rights, etc., they knew very well from a study of the Soviet economy under Stalin just how much it was achieving. You can look back at the 30s during the 5-year plans that were enacted then, and you can see just how both impressed and frightened they were getting, and just how far it had gone towards achieving the aims that Stalin's talking about here in his work from 1907. And that is why, of course, they were so relentless in pushing back against it to try and destroy it as far as they possibly could, using every method they possibly could find. But in the end, what of course weakened and destroyed the Soviet Union was an internal failure that grows up from really a failure to properly understand some of the things that Stalin's going to be talking about in the latter part of this chapter that we're looking at today. But I wanted to hammer that point home, and I encourage you to read the 1977 Constitution and also the books by Albert Zimansky on the sort of late period Soviet Union in the early 1980s. Again, for all the problems that it did have caused by pro-capitalist reforms, this was still a society and a state that had gone a long way towards achieving socialist objectives. And this is why, from the point of view of the imperialists, it was absolutely imperative for them to destroy it. It's why they still to this day will sing hymns to Gorbachev. I'm surprised they haven't commissioned a stained glass window of him in Westminster Abbey, to be honest, because he really did save them from potential disaster themselves. So, moving then to look at further points that Stalin makes in this particular chapter. So, here we go. Next one that I wanted to draw your attention to is here. I'll read the quote, as always. It is also clear that future production will be socialistically organized, highly developed production, which will take into account the needs of society and will produce as much as society needs. Here there will be no room for scattered production, competition, crises, or unemployment. And that's something that I wanted to emphasize again when talking about the Soviet Union, because, again, even in the latter period, up to about 87, there was no unemployment in the USSR. The planned economy was still stood strong and was only plunged into unemployment of any degree thanks to Gorbachev's market reforms. So what Stalin's talking about there is, of course, the development of a planned economy and the development of a plan of production that would enable us to assess what the resources of our nation, both natural and human, are capable of producing, what we can grow, what we can build, which resources need to be assigned to which part of the country, etc., etc. And of course, the high period in the Soviet Union, the revolutionary period, and even the revisionist periods that came after it, continued to prove the superiority of this method of economic construction and management over the decaying capitalist states. And it took imperialism an awful lot of resources in order to try and keep its head above water in the post-World War II world. And if you look at the sheer success of the Soviet Union in the period of socialist construction, if you even look at the successes of somewhere like East Germany, even some of the more dubious people's democracies in a place like Poland, even there you got big successes in terms of being rapid rebuilding from World War II. And even in places like Yugoslavia, which deviated from the socialist path, you again saw some rapid rebuilding from the semi-planned economy there in a way that you wouldn't have done in a country like that had it just been left to so-called market forces. So the planned economy, in terms of actually reviving places that were considered to be backwaters, poverty-stricken backwaters, building up places like Albania, which had been a poor, isolated, backward corner of Europe for really about 1,000 years before Enver Hoxha and the Albanian Party of Labour come along and actually revolutionize that society. Take it from being a backward colony of fascist Italy to being a industrialized nation that was self-sustaining when it came to food production. All of that is done because of the planned economies and the way in which planned economies can actually develop even backward and poor countries to the point where they can shed what Stalin goes on to talk about later in this chapter, which is, he calls it the bestial habits of man, and genuinely develop people into more educated individuals, more free individuals in a genuine sense, because you're freed from both want and ignorance. All comes from having a planned economy in which the masses are participants in, which they were in the Soviet Union. They continued to be up until, albeit with restrictions pushed in by Khrushchev and Kosygin and others, the so-called reforms pushed by the pro-capitalist clique in the Soviet Union, they always dressed them up as either efficiency or democratic reforms. This was particularly true of Gorbachev. I'm going to make the system more democratic. Well, the system was more democratic when the masses could participate directly in economic planning. Gorbachev, of course, destroyed economic planning and gave them bourgeois democracy, which gave them much fewer rights, much fewer abilities to actually be the rulers of the system in a socialist sense than existed previously. It was a counter-revolution in every single sense. And I'm emphasizing this just to hammer home the point that you have to understand socialist systems in this way. If you look at a place like Democratic People's Republic of Korea these days, where it's of course condemned as a monarchy or various other bizarre descriptions. Okay, if you haven't listened to it already, go and listen to the interview I did recently with Dermot Hudson from the Korean Friendship and Association, where we were talking about the involvement of the masses in the planned economy. And without the involvement, active involvement of the masses in the economy and the state and the party, then DPRK wouldn't have survived. And it's where the masses were pushed out of playing that role, where they were pushed into depoliticization or being apolitical, where they were atomized, subjected to the restoration of capitalist property relations, dressed up as bourgeois democracy, that revolutions went backwards and then collapsed. And that's the biggest lesson of the 20th century. And that is, of course, the lesson that nobody really wants you to learn, other than, of course, Marxist-Leninists. Peter, can you clarify, is your question related to the USSR? I'm guessing it is. I'll answer it at the end if that's the case. So, moving on to look at several other quotes and the themes that Stalin's developing throughout this particular chapter. So, next quote reads as follows. Socialist society presupposes an adequate development of productive forces and socialist consciousness among men, their socialist enlightenment. At the present time, the development of productive forces is hindered by the existence of capitalist property, but if we bear in mind that this capitalist property will not exist in future society, it is self-evident that the productive forces will increase tenfold. Nor must it be forgotten that in future society the hundreds of thousands of present-day parasites and also the unemployed will set to work and augment the ranks of working people. And this will greatly stimulate the development of the productive forces. As regards men's savage sentiments and opinions, these are not as eternal as some people imagine. There was a time under primitive communism when man did not recognize private property. There came a time, the time of individualistic production, when private property dominated the hearts and minds of men. A new time is coming, the time of socialist production. It will be surprising if the hearts and minds of men become imbued with socialist strivings. Does not being determine the sentiments and opinions of men? So, I wanted to pause there to talk about that, and of course what that means in terms of the future planned economy, socialistic production. So what he's arguing there, of course, is partly what we've been talking about, which is the benefits of the planned economy and how that is going to, of course, change the nature of people over time. But remember what Stalin said previously in the last chapter about the consciousness of humans, the consciousness of us all lagging behind the material changes. And remember, Stalin gives the example of the petty bourgeois individual craftsman who falls into the proletariat, and he goes from being an independent shoemaker to having to work in a shoe plant in Tbilisi in the early 20th century. And his consciousness remains petty bourgeois until, of course, he is fully attuned himself to his new material circumstances, the new set of class relations in which he finds himself. And then, of course, he has to come to terms with the fact that his only way forward is to engage in the collective struggle that he can join with his fellow proletarians. And it is only then he starts to develop a proletarian consciousness. So Stalin's arguing there that of course, the nature of human beings, he says the nature of man, that's just the phraseology of the time, but the nature of human beings being, of course, changeable. And he's arguing against the views you get up to this day, which is that you can't have socialism because man is a savage creature, a beast, barely out of the jungle, barely able to actually string a sentence together without either beating somebody to death or gnawing on some raw meat. And this is, of course, an argument that sounds cartoonish, but is an argument you get back. People are too selfish, too violent, too obsessed with themselves to have socialism work. Well, socialism has worked in many different locations, continues to work in places like the DPRK, continues to have victories in places like Cuba. And if it was completely impossible, then quite frankly, the imperialists wouldn't have had to work so hard to try and destroy it. Peter, I've seen your question. Yes, I will come to it, though my answer may be truncated. If you want me to cover the rise of Khrushchevite revisionism, I can do in a future program, but I will give you an answer at the end. So to come back to the point, Stalin's making the point there that the bestial nature of man is not something which is permanent. The bestial nature that some people display, the antisocial, genuinely antisocial nature of many people, including those in the proletariat who show these tendencies, comes from, ultimately, it derives from the private ownership of the means of production, extreme alienation, extreme atomization, and of course the fact that we're living in a deeply rotten period of capitalism, which is not going forward, which is only going backwards and devouring itself. And that perspective that is generated from that degenerated condition, so to speak, is what starts to develop people into all kinds of bizarre pathologies and displaying morbid symptoms, shall we say. Now, of course, as Stalin has also said in the previous chapters, the equation doesn't always follow, of course. Just because we're not crude materialists here, just because someone grows up, shall we say, in poverty-stricken circumstances does not follow in 9 times out of 10 cases that that person is going to become a criminal. But it makes it more likely that some people will descend into criminality and barbarism if they grow up either in poverty-stricken situations or they grow up in a situation where they are subjected to extreme alienation, atomization, and displays of antisocial behavior from a very early age, influenced not just by direct poverty, but the degenerated culture which this particularly retrograde period of capitalism has produced, then they are more likely to become antisocial elements later in life, or perhaps quite early in life. So Stalin's talking now about the opportunity being opened up for people to overcome these, what I'm going to continue calling antisocial tendencies. But of course, he's not naive about it. He's not somebody who just says, as we've seen in the previous chapter, he's not somebody who just says, well, sort the material circumstances, then job done. Everybody will, well, to quote the line from the old hippie song, smile on your brother, everybody get together, try to love one another right now. Stalin wasn't a hippie. So this next passage will indicate how he saw the struggle moving forward. So next quotation reads as follows: "The socialist revolution must not be conceived as a sudden short blow. It is a prolonged struggle waged by the proletarian masses who inflict defeat upon the bourgeoisie and capture its positions. And as the victory of the proletariat will at the same time mean domination over the vanquished bourgeoisie, as in a collision of classes, the defeat of one class signifies the domination of the other. The first stage of the socialist revolution will be the political domination of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie." Now, of course, what Stalin is referring to there is the dictatorship of the proletariat, the thing that the reformists, the various forms of Trotskyite, and of course even the Khrushchevite revisionists themselves, and revisionists of all kinds, don't want to talk about. And they don't want to talk about it because they've all strayed away from it. Whereas, and I think this might actually start to answer Peter's question, because what Stalin's starting to investigate here and outline is the fact that the revolution, though it might come about via a singular moment or be personified, shall we say, in a singular moment, such as the storming of the Winter Palace, which, thanks to the Eisenstein film about the October Revolution, comes to personify that. But that's not, of course, the beginning of the revolution, nor is it the end of it. That is just a particularly dramatic, and due to the nature of the production of modern pieces of art about it, it has become immortalized in our minds that that's what a revolution looks like. But as Stalin is pointing out here, it is the start of a domination over the vanquished bourgeoisie, and to again return to his exploration of the lag in consciousness from last week in chapter 2, because you have that lag in consciousness, it's not just a case that you are seeking to establish domination over the vanquished bourgeoisie, though that is, of course, the first objective, to ensure that the forces of the old ruling class have been destroyed and are not going to return. That's the first objective. The other part of it, and this is something that both Stalin and Mao talk about, is the necessity of ongoing class struggle. Mao talked about the class struggle intensifying after the revolution. And that's certainly true. And it's been true in the Soviet Union, it's true in China, it's true in the DPRK, and Kim Il-sung seems to have had a very profound and deep understanding of the necessity of that struggle intensifying during a period of socialist construction and to have learnt that lesson, whereas others didn't. And this actually takes us quite neatly to Peter's question, which is, well, why does Khrushchevite revisionism come about? The Khrushchevite revisionists represented, well, a certain coalition of interests, some of which were definitively pro-capitalist and saw Khrushchev, this sort of oafish idiot who really was just an arse kisser and had a certain talent for administration, but mainly was an arse kisser. And they saw in Khrushchev somebody who they could get behind and who would forward their interests. And what they wanted, to come to the question, was to get out of this struggle. They were an opportunist tendency, a pro-capitalist tendency, which emerged within the Soviet party and state, which Stalin was, of course, fully aware of the problems that could emerge of this pro-capitalist tendency re-emerging and growing up again within the party and the state, which is why he and later Mao were both insistent upon continual struggle, the continuation of the struggle of the proletariat against these tendencies that were going to emerge when you still had to have a state, when you still had to have a certain amount of bureaucracy to manage elements of it, and that would necessitate a perpetual struggle against that until, of course, you could actually start to shed elements of that bureaucracy until the working class were ready to move to higher stages of socialist development. But when you have not only a situation where you are struggling to develop socialism, you've gone a long way towards it, but you're still not there yet, and of course you have the enormous power that still existed within American imperialism at that time, then, of course, the combination of that is going to help to create pro-capitalist layers who are going to look at the United States and its enormous industrial potential and development and think that, well, why can't we quickly get to that? That was Khrushchev's opportunism. If you look at things he said, things he wrote, he wanted to, because he was this sort of personification of bureaucratic interests, he, on behalf of this element of the bureaucracy, wanted to get away from what Stalin's talking about, which is that struggle against the bourgeoisie. He wanted to bring an end to that struggle internally, and he wanted to reach an accommodation with imperialism internationally, because a whole bunch of these people thought that if they just cut a deal with imperialism, that imperialism would leave them to develop, well, some of them would say socialism, some of them would say a easier path to socialism. It's all basically the same kind of reformism and opportunism. And they wanted to be able to do that, and they wanted to be able to weaken the influence of the working class in the governing of the Soviet state. Now, it took them 30 years to be able to get to the point where they could finally do that. But that's, in essence, why they emerged, is because they emerged out of a bureaucratic layer within the Soviet state that both Stalin and Mao and others were very aware was a problem, was a danger, and it needed to have the dictatorship of the proletariat firmly in place in order to hold those tendencies down and drive them back. And that is why in the Gorbachev era, he and people like Yakovlev, his number two, were so determined to destroy the party, because the party remained the personification of and the expression of working class power. Even in the compromised form that it remained into the 80s, it still remained a system of organized working class power that had to be overcome and destroyed. But that's where they come from. The Khrushchevites came from bureaucratic degeneration within the party that was always going to be a risk in this intensely difficult period of building socialism when imperialism still exists. So I hope I've answered your question there, Peter. So, Junior Cadiz says, Jesus Christ was a socialist. Well, I don't agree, but happy to discuss. Ash says, antisocial tendencies are tied to material conditions. The right used to claim that capitalism matches our innate nature. now agree it is making us more narcissistic, but think the solution is more capitalism. Yeah, they think that the people on the right think that the struggle against antisocial tendencies involves two things. It involves increased powers for the cops, which of course in certain circumstances working class people will end up supporting because there's no alternative that they can see to more powers to the cops and locking more people up if they've got a particular problem with antisocial tendencies in their area. And the other solution that the right will turn to is, of course, endless moralizing in religion. And of course, what they don't realize, or what they don't want to face, is the very fact that it is this degenerated capitalist system, which they're always defending endlessly, the Ben Shapiro's of the world, that is producing many of the things that they identify as negatives, which are correctly identified as negatives, and that they decry. Well, it's the very system which they love so much and spend so much time telling us how wonderful it is that is creating those problems, of course. But good luck getting them to realize it. Peter says, the work of revolution isn't simply evental, but ongoing, over the long term to protect against resurgence. Great vigilance required over the long term. Yes, what's required over the long term is the continual raising of the educational and cultural level of the working class in order that they can consistently fulfill the active duties, shall we say, of being rulers of society. That almost any worker from any industry, community, wherever, can play a role in the governing of the state. That is our objective in the intermediate period. While it's still necessary to have a workers' state, it is necessary for us to have workers governing it in as many different areas as possible, and to keep these bureaucratic tendencies in check. Now, this, again, is especially a problem when you still have imperialism present, because imperialism represents not only a real material force in the world, but of course growing out of that material force is its ideological force. And it is certainly the case that in the Soviet Union and in China, you had ideological capture of certain elements of the party and the state by imperialism. Whether that was direct corruption, they were recruited by the CIA or MI6, or it was ideological degeneration. They were too impressed by the things they saw in the imperialist countries and didn't ask any questions about how the imperialist countries got to have them. So Peter's right, it is a continual struggle, which is what, of course, Khrushchev wanted to get rid of with his nonsense about a state of the whole people. That's why Soviet leaders post-Khrushchev stopped talking about class struggle internally and started saying, well, we're a state of the whole people now. The class struggle internally is over. It, of course, wasn't. This was a cover to sort of slap on top of various different opportunistic things that they were doing. They were resisted in this, of course, by other elements of the party for a long time, which is why it took them so long to eventually bring the Soviet Union down. But yes, it's perpetual vigilance and struggle, and the dictatorship of the proletariat will have to run for a long time until, of course, these tendencies within the party and the state are defeated. And really, they're only going to be finally defeated when imperialism is defeated as well, because it is imperialism that is at the heart of this problem that the Soviet state was having, although there would, of course, be other problems as well. But this was the role of imperialism, the presence of it, created all these issues within the Soviet state that a more active dictatorship of the proletariat could have continued to hold down, and came close to being able to overcome at various different times. But the fact that the leadership were perpetually able to keep pushing down the capitalist line, even though they were held back from for quite a long time, that is a problem that I know that the Koreans certainly studied. Enver Hoxha took it seriously, even though unfortunately Albania was unable to withstand the restoration of capitalism. But we can talk about Albania on another day. If I start talking about that, we'll be here for a very long time. But this is the point I wanted to get across. So we'll move now to the next particular quotation from Stalin's work. Just let me call this up. And if there's any more questions, I will come to them at the end. So, here we go. Quote reads as follows. This means that until the bourgeoisie is completely vanquished, until its wealth has been confiscated, the proletariat must without fail possess a military force. It must without fail have its proletarian guard, with the aid of which it will repel the counter-revolutionary attacks of the dying bourgeoisie, exactly as the proletariat did during the Commune. So, Stalin is of course talking about there is the need for essentially a proletarian army, a Red Army or a People's Liberation Army, if you will. And if you look at the way in which both the Soviet armed forces, the Red Army was built, all the way through its history, it was something that was actually embedded in the working class. Even in the degeneration period after, with Khrushchev and after, you did get a high degree of politicization both amongst the ranks of the armed forces and the officer corps as well. Remember, there was many Soviet officers who tried to stage an uprising against the Yeltsin gang in 1993. And so the politicization level of the Red Army was quite high. It did degenerate, though, towards the end. And, of course, it is necessary, as Stalin says here, to actually have this armed force present until, of course, the external enemies have been defeated. Now, of course, this presents problems. It presents the need to keep the army under the control of the organized working class, under the control of the workers' state, and ultimately the ruling party. But it is absolutely necessary to have this, and it's absolutely necessary that it is a politicized army, much as the PLA was built during a long period of struggle for the revolution in China. And Stalin mentions there the Commune, which of course did arise partly out of an armed force, the French National Guard, and the only mistake that of course Marx identifies the Commune as making in his work on the Paris Commune is that it didn't immediately march up the road to where the new government, the Versailles government, was sitting and either arrest them all or shoot them all. But we can come to the Paris Commune in future episodes, so I wanted to just highlight that for now. So, final quotation from the book before we move to final questions. So, final quotation reads as follows. There is another kind of dictatorship, the dictatorship of the proletarian majority, the dictatorship of the masses, which is directed against the bourgeoisie, against the minority. At the head of this dictatorship stand the masses. Here there is no room either for a camarilla or for secret decisions. Here everything is done openly, in the streets, at meetings, because it is the dictatorship of the street, of the masses, a dictatorship directed against all oppressors. Now, again, I would say the Soviet Union made a hell of a lot of progress in getting towards that. And the way in which you can tell that is, of course, the direct participation en masse of the workers in the 5-year plans in the 30s, the way in which the working class and peasantry rallied to the defense of the country against the invading Nazis in a way that reactionaries to this day cannot fully explain, because they don't want to take the idea of the workers and peasants being invested in the country because they knew that it was their country, that they owned it and controlled it. And of course, you look further afield, you look at, say, Cuba, you look at, again, the DPRK, you can see where the masses have this, again, direct role within the system to play their role in governing it, but also to emphasize what Stalin says here. It's the dictatorship over the minority, and this is a dictatorship of the masses. And again, this is what we have to consider when the discussion comes to things like so-called democracy, or in reality bourgeois democracy. It's why I try my best never just to fall into the tendency of talking about democracy in the abstract. It's always got to be a discussion of democracy as an element of class, as what kind of democracy are we talking about here? Are we talking about ancient Greek democracy, where it was democracy only for slaveholders? Or are we talking about bourgeois democracy, where you have the most lowest possible level of participation, which is, of course, sticking an X in a box every 4 years and hoping for the best? Or are we talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat? Are we talking about proletarian democracy, which is about, as I said before, the ongoing engagement of the masses in the running of society, in the running of the state, in the making up of and the running of the armed forces? Is that what we're talking about? Because if we're talking about that, then the revolutionary period of the Soviet Union, then China, then the DPRK, then Cuba are immeasurably more democratic than anything that the capitalist nations have to offer. Because again, it's democracy without the class descriptor added to it is a meaningless term. Bourgeois democracy is, as we all know, the absolute minimal level of participation. There is no participation by the masses in the running of the state in a bourgeois system of production, particularly not in the very powerful imperialist nations. The masses are kept at a very firm distance from anything to do with the running of the state. In fact, that's pretty much written into the laws. So when looking at a nation like, again, People's Korea or any of the other nations that have gone through a proletarian revolutionary process in the 20th century, you can see that it's the direct involvement of the masses in the running of the state that justifies the continuance of the dictatorship of the proletariat, because it is that dictatorship involves the mobilization of the masses through the party and the state in the governing of that country. And it is, of course, the weakening of that by the Khrushchevite revisionists and other forms of revisionists, this insistence that it's, oh, well, now the struggle's over and we're all just one happy the state of the whole people, to use Khrushchev's terrible phrase, that you start to see the weakening come in. It's the, again, to emphasize the point, the dictatorship of the proletariat is this embodiment of this long period of struggle against the external class enemies and against the re-emergence of class enemies internally as well, and the re-emergence of bourgeois tendencies. And again, it calls for absolutely eternal vigilance and a high level of culture and a high level of education on the part of the masses in order that they can stop the emergence of these damaging tendencies, these very destructive tendencies that do tend to emerge in all countries going through this revolutionary process. So, pausing then for more questions. Peter says, raising the educational level of the working class, is that why bourgeois education teaches working class youngsters IDPOL? To mystify and divide them? Well, yes. I mean, anything involving idealism and reactionary fantasies and ways to divide and subdivide the working class, yes, certainly. That's why they teach them IDPOL. It's also why they used to teach them how to pray for the Church of England, you know, to God and flag and Queen, or God and flag and King. Now, they might swap out IDPOL for something else, but the constant aim of the mass education for the working class under capitalism is not, of course, to make you the ruler of society or to make you be able to become a class that can rule society. It's to make you, to, in the words of the late, great George Carlin, just smart enough to push a button on a machine, but dumb enough to not realize how you're getting stiffed every single day. And that's capitalist education summed up. Yuan says, thank you. Any plans to do a stream on India's working class potential in view of the infestation of neoliberalism, sectarian and religious division, and caste system? could do in the future. I'd need to do a lot of reading on it first, though. So definitely some potential in doing that. Kai says, I got to go early, comrades. My town is flooded. My bridge barely survived. Well, sorry to hear that, comrade. I hope everything's okay with you and that you get yourself sorted. Hegel on human nature as the community of minds, says Yuan. Well, I'm on a Hegel binge at the moment, so I know what you mean there. Ben says, regarding points on education and cultural development of the workers to maintain the proletariat, Juche has as one of its three main pillars giving precedence to ideological consciousness. Yes, that's a good point. Juche, of course, being what I would argue is the further development of Marxist-Leninism in the Korean context by Kim Il-sung and others, and the way in which they see the role of the masses it's completely an extension of the Marxist-Leninist methods to, again, the Korean context. So be sure to read up on what has been done in the Korean Revolution and why it has thrived for as long as it has and why it will continue. It's also why, with regard to DPRK, the only thing you ever see about it is demonization. What happens is that in the news cycle, the DPRK, when there's a story about it, it will appear, it will just be called some kind of nightmare place. They will do no investigation and show you no actual pictures of the DPRK, and then it will disappear again. Because if you look at actual pictures of the DPRK, you can see that they're actually made incredible advances in recent years and that their economy has actually done great things since the tough period in the 1990s. Again, go back and listen to the interview I did recently with Dermot Hudson about that. But that brings us to the end of this particular study of Stalin's work, Anarchism or Socialism. And I hope that what you've got out of that is a couple of core things. The main couple of things to take away from it. First of all, that Stalin as a writer who can introduce many different subjects to workers who might be at a relatively low political level, Stalin's still an almost unmatched teacher when it comes to that. Second point is, of course, the development of consciousness and the way that consciousness can lag behind material developments, and of course why that necessitates, as we've just covered in chapter 3 of the book, the dictatorship of the proletariat is of course a necessity, but within that dictatorship the continual raising of the educational and cultural level of the working class so that they can play their role as the rulers of society, and also so that they can engage in struggle against the redevelopment or the coming back of the old bourgeoisie, or the development of deviations within the party or the state that threaten the dictatorship of the proletariat. Khrushchevism, revisionism, other forms of it as well. And that is absolutely crucial. And it is because, of course, that consciousness can lag behind material developments, even in workers' states, that you need this constant level of vigilance against this degeneration that we've seen in the 20th century and against the attempts of the imperialists to infiltrate themselves in all kinds of ways, and why you need a perpetually active working class within the party, within the state, and also why you need to have every worker that's possible to play a role in society, be able to play a role in a workers' state, be able to play their role in the dictatorship of the proletariat, be able to engage with the political process, question those who are regarded as the experts, and hopefully we'd have a much better cast of experts in the dictatorship of the proletariat and under a planned economy than we do now. So the essence of the book, I would say, is that it's about development of consciousness. It's about how consciousness interacts with material conditions but isn't strictly dictated in an equation type form to material conditions, about how Marxists are not just crude materialists who say, well, material base equals consciousness. Why? The development of consciousness and the changing of consciousness takes active class struggle. So thank you to everybody who has tuned in tonight. I will just go do a roll call. Thank you to Terry, Peter, Kai, Slava, Banana Bender, Paul Charo, CJ, Ash, Jason, Junior Cadiz, Yuan, Ben, and I think that's everybody. So thank you for everybody who has tuned in tonight. It's been a really interesting discussion as always. This brings us to the end of Stalin's work on anarchism or socialism. There will be more up next week, and I'm just going to call up the study guide here to give you an indication as to what we're going to be looking at next. So next, it's going to be Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao himself, a work on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. Another excellent work on consciousness and struggle. So I'm just going to drop the link to that in the chat. You can find an ebook version, a PDF version of Mao's work on the correct handling of contradictions among the people there. So until next time, thank you to everybody who's tuned in. The audio for this will be available on both the website and the Patreon page. Until tomorrow, when I will be back with you to do the Saturday Q&A. So if you have questions, be sure to note them down. I will bid you adieu and thank you for tuning in.